Dr. Phil Maffetone. I am so excited to welcome you to the Better Podcast. Welcome.
Thanks, Stephanie. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I reached out to you because I wanted to talk about aerobic capacity, how we can maximize our efficiency, which we're going to talk a lot about today. And you're very well known for this formula that we're going to talk about in terms of how we can increase our aerobic function and capacity. Whether you are somebody who is looking to augment performance, or you're a weekend warrior, or you just want to lose a little bit more fat and you want to stop gaining and losing the same 10 pounds over and over again. So, which is, a problem that I see a lot, especially particularly with women, the women that I look after. So before we jump into all that juicy stuff, I wanted to introduce my audience a little bit to you around your origin story, your backstory. Of course, I know you're a chiropractor, very impressive clinical history. And you also started out as a runner. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was a runner in high school and I ran in college. And when I got out into practice, I started doing road racing. And so, yeah, but I also played baseball, football. I swam competitively. I cycled when there were hardly any cyclists around. And eventually did some triathlons and all kinds of other things. I was pretty good in sports with the exception of basketball for some reason.
And when we talk about your, as I mentioned, I want to discuss your clinical insights that eventually led to the development of the maximum aerobic function test, which we're going to get to. You wrote a paper in 2016 titled "Athletes Fit but Unhealthy." I wanted to maybe start there, and if you could unpack some of the observations that you were having in clinical practice with the athletes under your care, who, whether it's their training regimen, gait, posture, mechanical distortions, why they kept re-injuring themselves, and how do you distinguish between someone who is fit and someone who is healthy?
Yeah, this is an interesting thing, and it really started to come together when I was a student, because a lot of the people I had worked out with, a lot of the teams, kind of for fun teams, and then some of the competitive people that were around were injured a lot. And I thought, well, I guess I'm not injured a lot because I'm lazy. I was a lazy athlete. I did really well being a lazy athlete. And I always wondered about that. And I realized that people were just running themselves into the ground. And soon after I got into practice, I started seeing it up close with the patients I was working with, the athletes in particular, people who were, working out regularly, becoming really good athletes from a competitive standpoint. And yet they were sick all the time. They had all kinds of physical problems. They had biochemical problems, mental, emotional problems, and you name it, or combinations of those. And in 1980, I ran the New York City Marathon, and I'm thinking, somehow I was thinking about this. I guess I needed something to think about to get me through those last few miles. And as I'm crossing the finish line, I'm thinking, gee, there's this thing between health and fitness that, we throw those terms around so loosely, when in fact they're very specific. Health is a system where everything in our brain and body is working in harmony. All the different systems, the neuromuscular system, the digestive system, the nervous system, and so forth. Fitness is different. Fitness is the ability to be physically active, to be competitive if you're a competitive athlete. And they don't always come together the right way. And as a result, I had this idea that athletes can be unhealthy. And I got a lot of flack for that back in the 80s. And because we are in this society where, it's sort of like everything's cut and dry. What do you do? Well, I do this. And if you do more than one thing, you're considered an oddball. And athletes were the epitome of health. They were like on a pedestal. They were the healthiest humans on earth. So we're told by the newspapers, the sports magazines, and just the general feeling from the entire population. Well, that's totally wrong. When you have a 28-year-old marathoner who's a professional world-class athlete dropping dead at 5 miles into a marathon, that 28-year-old was not healthy, because you don't collapse and die at age 28 when you're a great marathoner. And so it took a while, but and I wrote about this in a lot of the books I wrote and the textbooks and so forth. And finally, in 2016, you said, the article "Athletes Fit But Unhealthy" was published in Sports Medicine, I believe. And that kind of shook up the sports world a little bit, even at that late date. And I talked about overtraining, and I defined health, and I defined fitness, and it was, I think you're starting to see things change now, and people are realizing that, gee, I'm an athlete, but I'm sick a lot, or I'm hurting a lot. I've got recurring injuries. Therefore, something's wrong. Those are not normal.
Right. And I think that pairs up with my own clinical observation as well. So in clinic, I would see marathon runners, and they always looked like they were closest to death than any other athlete specifically the marathon runners. It was recurring injuries, always like the knee or the foot, the ankle, the toe, whatever it was, always getting sick, always mentally worn down, but also, peculiarly or not, married to the idea that training should feel like punishment. Like every time they go out, they need to kill it. They need to destroy their leg. And they would use terms like that. Like, I am going to go and destroy my legs. I am going to go and, mar my body. And, maybe they didn't say it that way, but there was almost this mentality, almost this like badge of honor. Like, oh, I ran like, whatever it was, 30K, 40, whatever it was, my long run on Sunday. And now, I can't walk today. And it's like, guys, this is
but
not.
I'm going to train anyway because my competitors are training, so I've got to train. Yeah, we have this obsession with injuries in particular. Injuries are glorified, and we still see it today. It began years ago with television, when television started to show sports competition. The Olympics in particular, they would glorify injuries. If somebody was taped up, they'd say, hey, Big Joe plays hurt, he's tough. Well, what does that do to a 10-year-old kid who's listening to this and watching Big Joe out there limping around with all these bandages? He wants to play hurt too, because he wants to be considered tough. And in the beginning of the running boom, there was a phenomenon where runners would get high white blood counts, and after a short period of time, the running magazines started saying, "Well, this is a badge that you're training hard, that you're training right," and so if you have a high abnormal,
that your immune system is mounting a defense to your end. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it was, if you have this, congratulations, you're special, you're a runner, you're and it's just so much crap that the magazines get away with, the media in general, and society as a whole. We're teaching the wrong things to people, especially to kids, and it's really, once you get into that vicious cycle, it's hard to get out of it. It's hard to say, no, high white blood count is abnormal and it means you're overtraining, or this recurring knee injury you have means you're doing something wrong. Let's figure out what it is. And so, I've had athletes who were a little taken back by the fact that I'm going to be able to help them get rid of this knee problem and it's not going to return. It's like, well, what am I going to complain about? Complain about the weather. I mean, come on.
Right. Or the politics, something else,
Yes.
something else other than your knee. Yeah. And I would say that's true for women, like female athletes as well, which I've taken I have many athletes, female athletes under my, when I was still in clinical practice, amenorrheic, like their body fat percentages. We're going to talk about overfat, underfat in a moment, but didn't have periods because they were trying to get to this unattainable, unsustainable, I'll say, level of leanness that negated their fertility, right? So it's like this trade-off. And there was, I used to think about this, and I would actually, and this is a bit of a tangent, but I used to think that health and performance almost were at odds with each other, because in order to be healthy, you needed to do things like recover, like nurse the injury, to reverse some of the compensatory mechanical patterns that were living in the body to create that reoccurring low back or knee or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And performance is a very specific, especially if you're an elite athlete, you are doing the same movements over. It's like to perform at a high level is to be able to, in some cases, withstand overuse injuries. So I always thought that these two concepts, health and performance, were at odds with each other. And of course, we're going to talk about your approach, which sort of marries the two. But before we talk about maximum aerobic function, do you have any comments on that? Do you sort of agree with that thinking that, maybe before learning how to maximize mitochondrial function and the type 1 muscle fibers, that people were pushing themselves in the name of performance and sacrificing their health at the same time?
Oh, sure. That was a big part of the problem. And it was the perception. It was what I guess I would say it's what we all learned early on from our gym teachers. Not that I'm putting down gym teachers, but that was the trend. Let's do one more rep. Let's do one more lap really hard and don't slow down, This is running athletes into the ground, running teams into the ground, running them out of competition. That's most of these athletes leave their best performance on previous training routines and not on the day of competition. So yeah, and those those injuries can be physical as we know, but they can also be biochemical. You mentioned the hormone imbalance that women have, but men do too. Low testosterone, as an example, and the mental, emotional injuries that often come as depression, anxiety, and the miseducation. That's really a mental injury. That's a cognitive problem that people have. Is they're made to think a certain way that's wrong, and as a result, they follow through in the wrong path that brings them down a bad path to being unhealthy.
Right. And I think it extends to so many, we could honestly go on so many different tangents, but that extends to so many aspects of life. This is why people don't rest. People push themselves in their businesses until they fall apart. This is why, we don't honor self-care. And I know that that's a bit of it's a bit of a, we'll say a wishy-washy term, but people don't know how to slow down. People will resist that because it feels like, oh, now I'm being a sloth. Now I'm being lazy. What if I can never pull myself out of this again and get back into that hustle and grind mode?
Yeah, and it's really sad that that has become the trend. And it's interesting that corporate people who burn out, they're sitting at their desks all day and overworking and overstressing themselves, and they're burning out, have the same mechanisms from the brain down, stress mechanisms, physical, biochemical, mental, emotional stresses, identical to what athletes experience when they are overtrained. Now they're doing too much physical activity and they're not resting enough. The executive is sitting there all day, all week, and stressing himself or herself out in a different way, but the result is the same, and they both burn out. It's called burnout in corporate health. It's called overtraining in sports.
So let's talk a little bit about maximum aerobic function. This is first, maybe we want to define what is it, and then what might be the application of the MAF test for someone who's concerned with either health promotion or performance.
It's interesting. Our brain and body is well endowed with an aerobic system. And we never learn about that. We don't learn about it in school. I never learned about it until later on. And you didn't see it in the textbooks. I did learn it from McGardle's textbook, where he talks about the aerobic system, the slow, I forgot, he called it the aerobic system or the slow energy, I forgot. And it was just sort of a little section in passing. And I said, oh, this is the missing link. Now I'm seeing this thing better, because I had this obsessive brain where I couldn't look at things in a single format. I had to look at the big picture. I had to look holistically, and the aerobic system, its existence really completed the picture quite well, or helped complete the picture for me. From a standpoint of, hey, this is what I want to do for myself, and B, my passion is now to help other people, and I'm going to use this. And I did. Humans have always had this from the beginning. Humans have always moved slowly. We hunted and gathered, but we didn't sprint a whole lot. Once in a while, we got chased by an animal and we had to sprint, but that was an exception of the day. But we used this aerobic system to do that. And the fuel for the aerobic system is fat. We burn fat for energy for the aerobic system. And in fact, the aerobic muscles, the aerobic muscle fibers, use a lot of fat to obtain a lot of energy. So we could walk around all day long without fatiguing. If we tried to sprint all day long, we'd be exhausted in just a few minutes. And we'd be sore the next day, and not so with the aerobic system. So the human body has many different muscles that have mixed aerobic and anaerobic fibers. And those, unlike certain animals like chickens, where they have light and dark meat. The light meat is the anaerobic, and those are like the breast muscles, where they use those anaerobic muscles to flap their wings, which they can't do very well. That's why they don't fly much. They don't technically fly at all, because those muscles fatigue very quickly. But their leg muscles allows them to walk around and pick on food all day long without getting tired. Those are the aerobic muscles. And that's what humans have, except in a mixture. All of our muscles, or most of our muscles, the jaw joints being the exception, we can enlist these aerobic muscles so that all day long we've got all the energy we need to do the things we want to do. And in doing so, we obtain that energy from fats, stored fats. We take fat out of storage and convert it to ATP. And the amount of energy, potential energy we have is astounding. Yet here we are, the most common complaint heard by doctors is fatigue. Well, when you don't have the energy, when you can't burn fat, you're going to run out of energy. And if you kick in your sugar burning system, that's pretty limited. So you run out of that quickly as well. And then you're not just fatigued, you're exhausted.
Yeah, and I hear this all the time where, well, first, I mean, culturally, we see that we all pay attention to anaerobic type activities. Like if you look at the Olympics, back to your point, if you look at the sprints, everyone watches, the 100-meter sprint, maybe the 200-meter sprint, right? Those are all very much, well, maybe you can even argue that those are, type 2B fibers where you may even be superseding the ATP capacity of the muscle. And maybe you're just not even using any energy system there. You're just using the ATP that's stored in the muscle. But you have these anaerobic activities that everyone sort of glorifies and it's like the glammy type of activities. Whereas you're right, like the aerobic type of, as you mentioned, this is more of this beta oxidation, fat burning, where we have a higher, mitochondrial density, because that's how fat's burned. It has to get into the mitochondria. Whereas if you're in a glycolytic state, as you mentioned, it doesn't necessarily need to be burned in the mitochondria necessarily. It can be burnt, you can through the process of glycolysis, it can be in the cytosol, or it can be outside of the mitochondria. And I think that this is really important because I have a lot of women that are like, I don't know why I can't lose weight. Like I'm doing 5 Peloton classes, and I'm not like, no shade to Peloton, but 5 classes on this bike. My heart rate's like 190. I feel like I've just, it's like they feel like they're dying. And it's like, and I don't know why. And I have all this belly fat. And it's like, well, it's because you're not actually burning any fat. You may be burning these type 2A and B fibers, which have a higher glycolytic capacity, lower oxidative capacity, but you're not, as you said, that these type 1 fibers, you should be able to walk for hours without tiring. This sort of low level, some people might call it zone 1 or zone 2 training. I know we're going to talk about your formula in a moment. But I think that we've traded generalized low level movement for these very specialized high intensity bursts of activity. And to your point around the the executive, the burnout in the, they'll do Peloton in the morning. They'll do some crazy workout for an hour and then sit for the rest of the day versus walking. I talk about like movement snacks, like instead of going to the fridge for something, take a 5-minute walk around the block or go up and down the stairs or do something that's, you're not breaking out a sweat, but you're moving your body.
Yeah. They were, I suspect they still are, recommending these executives who are showing signs and symptoms of burnout that they play a hard game of squash. Get your frustration out on beating this ball and worsening your anaerobic excess state and suppressing your aerobic condition. It's a no pain, no gain world we live in. And that is spread across society. It's not just in sports. In fact, no pain, no gain came from Benjamin Franklin in his descriptions of business ventures and capitalism, basically. And he said we need to sweat and make it work. And it's hard work, and we need to I don't know that, that he was literal in that sense, but that's how it's been taken. And we are well entrenched in that on every level of society, teaching and parenting and, of course, sports. But it's sad. It's very sad because what we're doing is making the population more and more dysfunctional. And a big part of that is that the population is going into more and more of a aerobic deficiency where they're neglecting this fat burning system, and people are getting more and more over fat.
More and more over fat. Why is it important for us to maximize aerobic function? Like, what are the downstream benefits of maximizing beta oxidation in the muscle?
That's how we were built as human beings. In the animal world, there are sprinters like cheetahs who could really run fast, but they don't have much aerobic function. They can't kind of hunt at a slow pace all day long. And then they have animals that just kind of crawl, like turtles and other slower animals. But humans are unique in that we have the capacity to do both, but primarily we are aerobic animals. And if we don't follow those genetic requirements, we get in trouble. We don't burn fat, so we store it. If we don't burn fat, we don't take the fat in storage and burn it for energy. So now we don't have as much energy, and then we get cravings for junk food, and the brain's affected, the body's affected. Our overall human performance is affected adversely and quite quickly as well. So whether we're trying to learn or remember or formulate or create, whatever we're doing from a human performance standpoint is going to be impaired.
And I think as well, when we look at the musculoskeletal system, that's where we actually see metabolic dysfunction show up first, right? When we look at type 2 diabetics, they're not able to oxidize fats in the same way that someone who does not have that, or even just metabolic syndrome. You're not quite on the, maybe you don't quite yet have the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. These people have a problem oxidizing their fats.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not just the diabetics who we would know years before they became diabetic that they were headed that way. But we're talking about pretty much all the chronic illnesses, and of course the overfat condition, which is the combination of overweight, obesity, and the people who are not overweight but still have excess body fat. Those are the ones typically with too much belly fat. And then those downstream problems, those are all results of poor aerobic function. And this is not a difficult thing to measure in the laboratory or in a facility that has a treadmill test where you can measure the amount of oxygen uptake and carbon dioxide output. And then from that, you get the percent of fat burning and sugar burning at different heart rates. And what you see is in some of these people, even walking at a very slow pace, even they're doing the physical things that they think they should be doing, training slow, and they still can't burn fat because their metabolism is screwed up. And so there's a lot that has to be done with a lot of these people that have metabolic problems, and by fixing that, we then can start burning fat, and then health returns and fitness builds as well.
So if we've determined that we want to maximize our aerobic capacity, our aerobic efficiency, maybe through increasing the cross-sectional density of our type 1 fibers, I want to talk about your concept of maximum aerobic heart rate. Now we it's just like, 180 minus your age. Like that's the it's such a simple thing that anybody can do. But I'm curious about how you determine what a maximum aerobic heart rate is for an individual? Before you came up with that formula, what was the process for you in your clinical process that would help you come up with that number?
Well, I knew there were athletes who were performing well and trained well, and then those who didn't. And so I started looking at what are the features of a healthier athlete versus one who's not healthy, and then started looking at heart rate. This is before heart monitors really came out. I did use a cardiac strap that picked up the heart rate, and so I could accurately see what someone's heart rate was. And I started comparing heart rates with gait, heart rates with breathing rates, heart rate with how people felt. And I saw, for example, that as the heart rate went up as they were running, that their gait would become a little more irregular the higher the heart rate got. And so I interpreted that as a stress. This is a stress. A heart rate of 150 for this person is a stress, and it impairs their gait.
And you'd see what, like more pronation, more weirdness with propulsion? Like what would you see in terms of your, or?
In the beginning, it was very subtle. And I had learned a lot about posture and gait. It was a big thing for me. And so to see subtle changes in gait was not that hard. And what I did literally in the beginning was bring a bunch of runners and walkers to a high school track, and I would watch them go round and round. And I would kind of run back and forth. Sometimes I'd run with them, and I would take notes: who's doing what, what's your heart rate, and it was pretty obvious. After a while, you can see these subtle changes, and sometimes you'll see people recover from an irregular gait by slowing down. And so, the best way to think of it is stress. It's a stress. So what does the body do under stress? Well, it doesn't have the same neuromuscular balance. So there becomes this neuromuscular imbalance, and that's where the gait irregularity comes from. And then they breathe faster. It's hard to ask them how they're feeling because it's quite subjective. But you can see it in their faces. Once they get to a heart rate that's far enough over that nice place to be, that I call it a nice place to be. And I realized that nice place, right before their gait became irregular, that I want to keep them just below that, because as they run, they fatigue, even aerobically. We fatigue all day long, and it's not a problem because it's not so severe, and we recover by the next day if we're healthy. So I wanted to be conservative and have that heart rate a little bit lower. And then I realized that this is amazing, because over time, what I started seeing is that people were getting faster at the same heart rate. And I thought they must be burning more fat. That's what I assumed. And I thought this would be a good test for weight loss. We want to make sure people are burning fat. Let's do, they could walk or jog, and if they get faster at the same heart rate, then we know they're on the right metabolic pathway to lose body fat. Well, that certainly is true, but the fact that they got faster at the same heart rate was a huge thing for me from a coaching standpoint, because my goal with an athlete was to A, help them perform better, and B, keep them healthy. And that was a big key to that.
Yeah. And I that's what I think really excites me about that is that you can, if we're talking about it in the context of running, you can get faster. So you might start at, I don't know, a 10-minute mile, let's say, and you have a certain heart rate. Like if we're doing, if I were to plug in my age and all the particulars, my number would be 136. It's like 180 minus your age. I don't have any I'm not recovering from any illnesses right now. I don't get sick, ever. I don't have asthma. I'm not over fat, all those things. So my number would be 136. So what excites me about that is that staying at 136, I can go from, let's say, a 10-minute mile to a 9.5 minute mile. And then I can progress to a 9-minute mile, et cetera. I'm not a big runner, actually. I have a lateral trainer, which is, it's kind of like an elliptical, but instead of going in the sagittal plane, it's in the coronal plane. So it's almost like you're skating, because I'm a really big fan of coronal plane exercises in general. I don't think we do enough of them. So anyway, so I have this, and my, machine has a wattage, like it'll tell me how many watts I'm pushing. So I am always trying to say, okay, can I do 130 watts and stay at 136? And then can I continue to progress? Can I do more? Can I increase the intensity of the output, but maintain the same heart rate? And that's what I think is so exciting about this, because as you increase your mitochondrial density, your capacity for beta oxidation, then your fat burning capacity, which is what we want when it comes to weight loss. Like we always use the term weight loss, but you don't want to lose brain mass or your bone mass or your organ mass. You want to lose adipose tissue.
Right.
We're gonna talk about why that's important in a moment. But that is it's this low and slow idea, like less is more, that I really want to make sexy, because everyone wants to do like the crazy. They want to be running at full thing with like a 45-pound plate on the treadmill for Instagram. And it's like, this is not how you train. This is not how anybody trains.
It's hard to make it sexy because we're going the other way from no pain, no gain. And no pain, no gain is the ultimate sexy thing. And that's why it's so popular.
Right.
And when you say to somebody, I want you to work out slowly, I want you to get on that stationary bike and pedal really slow and don't exceed this heart rate, they laugh. And when you have a competitive athlete who is used to training,
your ego gets messed up in this.
Yeah, the ego is really, really tough. And it's, and I've said to more than one athlete that, because I know what they think. Oh, I'm going to be out there on the road running slow. What are people going to think? And I would say, well, train at night.
Right.
Go on stay at home on your treadmill.
Get a treadmill. Yeah.
Nobody will see you. We won't tell anybody.
So once you determine the proper, so you determine the heart rate that you should be training at in order to maximize fat burning capacity, so when you determine the intensity that's appropriate, how do you determine what volume of aerobic training is appropriate? I find I'm always dialing people back. So I'm always bringing people away, like step away from the bike, step away from the 5 times a week in the, in terms of classes. How do you prescribe volume for someone? Yeah,
it's hard. It depends on the person. It depends on, most importantly, it depends on their lifestyle. What do they have going on? Do they have a family, with 3 kids and a lot of social responsibilities? And do they work, 40, 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week? And if they do, are they able to train 100 miles a week because they're running a marathon? Because that's what so-and-so said years ago. And all the magazines say, well, you have to run 100 miles a week to run your... Well, that's a disservice they're providing, because that individual will burn out even at aerobic training at the right level at 100 miles a week, because that can't be maintained. And so you have to look at that and put, fit their training into their life, their lifestyle. And that's not easy to do either, because the idea is that we have our life here, our families and our work, and then we train. We train over here. And so you have people doing things like getting up at 4 a.m. to get their workout in. And as a result, lose an hour or two of sleep every night. Well, that's ridiculous, because they actually get stronger with the more sleep, the more rest they get. But you can't rationalize that. They have this 100 miles or whatever the number is for runners or for cyclists. So I take the distance out of the picture for them. I say, look, I'd like you to train by time, not by miles. So with your schedule, it looks like you could do an hour of running 5 days a week and 1 day of a longer workout. And I don't care how many miles it is. If it's a runner, there's no preconceived idea that you have to do this or that. And so don't even think about how many miles you're going. You're training for an hour. You're going to warm up slowly. You're going to maintain that. And then you're going to cool down. And after an hour, you're done. Simple. And that's a hard concept as well. But that's the training routine I had. And I found the same thing you did, is that most people want to do more. They're training slower, and they say, well, if I'm training slower, I need to add more training time. And of course, that's not true. So it's a tough sell all around. And I had a hard time in the beginning.
I think the other thing that I try to counsel people on, and I've noticed this in my own observations around my heart rate, there comes a point. Let's say I'm back to my 136 example. I'm training at 136. My watts are 120, or, you're running at a certain pace. And then there comes a point in that workout where my heart rate, I lose control of it. Like it just starts to kind of get all over the place. Like it's going up to 144 and then it's coming back down to 132. And then that's the point where I stop. So that for me, I try to look at heart rate, I try to use heart rate as a predictor of time. Like once I start losing control of that 136, where it's like, it's going up to 144 or whatever it is. And I'm trying to, use my, my parasympathetic breathing to like kind of bring down my heart rate again. And it keeps doing that. I'm sort of fighting with it. That's when I call it, because then.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's what's happening. You're not, technically what's happening is you're fatiguing. And in fact, if you just work out for 30 minutes, you're fatigued, and you'll notice that fatigue because you're going to have to slow down. After 45 minutes, you're going to have to slow down a little more, and after an hour, you're going to have to slow down even more. And so, using the heart rate takes into account the fatigue mechanism, and you have to adapt to that by slowing down. And as a result, you're going to get more out of your workout. But the big thing is that, by strictly adhering to this, and this is what people do naturally, unless they're exposed to all the social traditions of no pain, no gain, for example. When people are left on their own, and I've seen a few athletes in my career who have sort of been, not exposed to all this stuff. They were kind of novices maybe, or they were in another sport, and then they came into running or cycling, and they just did things naturally. And I was really pleasantly surprised to see that. But most people have a hard time with it. But when they do it right, and they start getting better, they start getting faster, they suddenly realize that They're going much faster than they were before. Now they're going faster than they used to train when their heart rate was 180. Now it's 140. And now, gee, all of a sudden, I'm having a hard time keeping up with my heart rate because it wants to slow down. And now they've gone from complaining they're training too slow to complaining they have to train too fast. And that could take a year or so or longer, depending on how disciplined they are. But that's always fun to see because it's an indication that they're succeeding. It's an indication that the system is working and the human body is cooperating and so forth.
And so do you ever, when you have a situation like that where someone, I mean, I might, maybe this is the incorrect terminology, but I would call that a plateau where someone is now, they've been working at a certain heart rate, they're able to go faster and now they have to work. Is there ever a point where you would increase the heart rate as they sort of have reached their maximal speed or is that never happens?
I would increase the heart rate if we've reduced it because they were unhealthy. So if they're on medication, for example, we'd reduce that training heart rate by 10, which is a lot, I know, but that's the way it is. And so now if we, we're going on 6 months and they've been able to eliminate their high blood pressure medication or whatever, we might move that heart rate up, or if they've had a lot of injuries and now they've been injury free for 6 months or whatever, we might increase that. But I think mostly what you're referring to is the fact that the aerobic system makes a lot of progress over the months. And at some point, it will hit a high peak of performance. And that would be the place where we could add anaerobic training if that's what the athlete wants to do.
Let's talk about nutrition and the impact that it may have on the individual's ability to use fat as fuel while exercising. And specifically, I'd love to ask you about your thoughts on macronutrient composition. I know you talk about carbohydrate intolerance as we age, but what are your thoughts on the macronutrient composition of a diet influencing an individual's ability to use fat as fuel?
Well, the diet has more of an impact on the ability to burn fat than exercise does. So if you do all the right things with your training, if you're using your heart, if you've got the correct heart rate for your needs, and if you're going out and you're very careful not to exceed that heart rate and you're warming up and cooling down and you're not exceeding a volume that interferes with your lifestyle and all that stuff. If you do all the right things, but you're eating badly, nothing is going to happen. You may even get worse. Any junk food, so any processed food, any food that's not natural or nutrient dense. And when I talk about this, I could almost hear people think, well, I don't eat any junk food. And that's a problem because they are eating a lot of junk food. In fact, people who say I'm not eating any junk food are often eating more junk food than natural food. And that's because they don't understand what junk food really is. They don't, just because that bread says whole wheat doesn't mean it's whole grain bread. It's junk food. Almost all bread is junk food. And most packaged foods are junk food. Most of the food you get in most restaurants is junk food. In most cafeterias, it's junk food. And the amount of sugar in food is it's incredible. You can't buy packaged food anymore that doesn't have sugar or something that turns to sugar very quickly, like a starch or a flour whatever, processed grains. People say, well, I have oatmeal for breakfast every morning and that's healthy, right? No, it's junk food. If it takes you 5 minutes to cook your oatmeal, it's junk food. It takes 45 minutes to cook real oatmeal, and most people have never had that. And so we need to take and I do it all the time. We need to take a look at what we're eating, because manufacturers are very sneaky. And they'll take a product that's been free of sugar and junk food and then suddenly start adding junk food, because their surveys say, people are not eating this as much anymore because they don't feel it's tasty enough. Well, tasty means we need to add sugar. And so we need to keep up with all that we're buying, because manufacturers are certainly keeping up with our tastes through their own market research.
Yeah, and there's so many different names for sugar. It's not just sugar. They have all these beautiful sort of, enticing names, right? Like agave and, all these different, but at the end of the day, it's sugar. It's, and many times it's fructose, right? And which causes its own.
Sugar is sugar. And people say, oh, well, I don't eat sugar. I don't eat any sugar. Well, that bagel you're having that you cut in half and you don't want to put any cream cheese on it because that's fat and I have too much fat. One half of that bagel turns to fat. That's what refined carbohydrates do. They break down, turn to sugar, and half of it is used for energy quickly, and the other half is stored as fat. And because you're storing that much fat, you're producing insulin, which is preventing you from burning stored fat later on in the day.
What are your thoughts on seed oils and emulsifiers? Because these are also, I think, sneaky little remnants that they put in food. Well, seed oils, people think, oh, it's a vegetable oil. It's a vegetable, must be good. It's like sunflower. Vegetables are good, right? So the oil must be amazing. Meanwhile, of course, very highly unstable, highly oxidizable, which can, cause rampant amounts of inflammation in the body. And then the other piece is emulsifiers, because I have people that'll say, oh, I'm keto, I have a bar, I have a protein bar, I have this. And it's like, well, if you look at the ingredients, yes, you're going to have some protein, you're going to have fat, but you're also going to see things like soy lecithin, all these emulsifiers that absolutely disrupt the gut microbiome, causes some of the receptors in the microbiome to actually retreat, like the satiety receptors to retreat further into the mucosa, so that you're not full. And how many people feel like I've had protein bars, I've had keto bar. I don't feel full after I have them. I can eat them way too quickly, like 2 bites and it's done. And I don't feel satisfied after. I find like 45 minutes, I'm sort of like, what else can I need something else right now.
Yeah, most so-called energy bars are junk food. 99% of them. I haven't followed that market anymore because it's really quite disgusting. But most energy bars are junk food. And as far as the oils go, excuse me, I think the first time I mean, this is old information, but it's a good example of how manufacturers feed us so many lies that we're hearing the lies so much that we start believing it. And so we avoid butter, we avoid coconut oil, we avoid things that are natural fats, and instead go to what sounds sexy, vegetable oils, polyunsaturated oils, this, and it's not just the manufacturers, the government is telling us to do that because the government is lobbied by the manufacturers. And so it's really a sad situation, and we're kind of on our own. We need to shop with all of these things in mind, and it's really, really hard. It's a lot easier today. Man, it used to be that you'd pick up a package of something and it would say, no sugar added. Well, the rules back then were that if you, the manufacturer, is making this product and you buy some raw material from somebody and that raw material has sugar in it, you could still say no sugar added. And, people say, oh, well, that doesn't happen today. Well, that particular example doesn't, because they've changed the laws, but they are equally sleazy in their marketing. And so we need to think, we need to understand what junk food really is. Junk food is anything that's not natural. And I think I have an article called "What Really Is Junk Food" or something, and I go through a lot of this. But it's we need to better understand. People need to get their nutrition from better sources than the media. That's what's been happening in really quite a few years.
Yeah, I remember. Who was I speaking to? I think we were actually talking about psychedelics. It was Jason Prawl, and he was saying that I can't remember how we got on the topic, but he was saying, places like China or Mexico, when they turn on the news, they know that it's propaganda. Like, they know that they're being fed crap. The problem with North Americans is that we actually think, we call it journalism, so we think that the media is like, has our best interests at heart. But of course, you've probably seen memes. I've seen them where it's like sponsored by Pfizer, sponsored by, they're all these conglomerate, like the media is just an arm often of big food and big pharma. And they will tell you what they want you to know, not what necessarily the truth is. And I'd rather.
Or they'll tell you they'll tell you what their sponsors want you to know, because that's who pays the bills. And this was the problem with a lot of the sports magazines. The running magazines would tell you how wonderful junk food was, and that we needed to eat more junk food if we want to run faster, and that we need to buy really bad shoes. I mean, really well advertised shoes. If we want to run, it's like, who has these editorial meetings? And it's really the advertisers that run the show.
Well, I remember just this past year, they did Euro 2020 in 2020 and 21, and Cristiano Ronaldo at the end of one of his games came down. I don't know if you saw this, but he came down for a press conference, speaking about his win or loss. I forget which one it was for Portugal, and he came to the press junket, and in front of him was a bottle of Coke, and he looked at the Coke. And he literally took it and put it out of the screen. Like, Coke is one of the sponsors of Euro 2020, which begs the question, why the hell is Coke a sponsor? Like, no athlete drinks Coke. Anyway, so he takes the two things of Coke and he goes, agua, like water, it's like, that's what I drink. And it's like, and so, of course, there was all these ramifications, like Coke stock plummeted. And then they started changing all these rules, like, no athlete can touch any of the sponsorship things, but it's like, why the F? Why in God's name? Why do we have Coke as a sponsor for a sporting event? Like, Cristiano Ronaldo is an elite athlete. He's not putting that shit in his body. There's no way.
The sponsors run the show. They're putting the money in, and they feel they could do anything they want, unfortunately, and event people say, well, yeah, let's get more sponsors and display. I mean, they're still doing the same things in movies and TV shows with cigarettes, for example. We were supposed to get rid of cigarettes. Well, we never really did. The number of cigarettes sold today are way higher than there ever was. And so, the junk food industry has really followed the same model as the tobacco industry, but they're more successful because they're not being beat up as much as the tobacco industry was and still is. But we still have tobacco; it's still a serious problem. But the junk food companies, Big Sugar, as I call them, and the scientific community is now saying that sugar is the new tobacco. And so that's good to see. But people have a distortion. They don't, because they don't put sugar in their coffee, they say, I don't eat sugar, when in fact they're eating a lot of sugar. And so it's a crazy world. And this is, we battle this all the time. And I have from the beginning. And it's really, back in the 70s, it was really hard to make a lot of the statements I've made today, because they would beat you up over it. And I would kind of have to let that happen because I stood my ground. And just the idea of running slow to get fast, what kind of nonsense is that?
Right.
But then when some of those, athletes started winning, people started paying attention to those crazy training ideas.
Talk a little bit about your 2-week test, because I think that this is, you've written about this on your website, which we'll make sure we'll link to some of the articles that we've been referencing here, as well as some of your blog posts. But I think that this is important because, on this idea of sugar, as we age, we become, particularly in our muscles, we become more anabolic. There's more resistance to growth, right? So you need to overcome that with like a higher protein bolus, for example. But with carbohydrates, I think naturally we become more insulin intolerant. We become less sensitive to insulin as we age. So talk a little bit about how we might improve our insulin sensitivity so that we are getting the energy into the cell so that it can create ATP.
Yeah, we're seeing a very serious problem. Years ago in the beginning, I would say people get more insulin resistant as they age. Referring to people who were 40 and 50, and at that point we may need to reduce our natural carbohydrate intake. Well, what's happened is we are becoming more and more insulin resistant at younger and younger ages. And an example, an obvious example, is the fact that we're seeing children with type 2 diabetes. And then they would say, oops, I guess we can't call it adult onset diabetes anymore because 12-year-olds now have it. And so this is the result of feeding babies junk food, mothers eating junk food when they're pregnant. And babies are born now with a really poor insulin mechanism, with being insulin resistant. And so we start feeding them things that that worsen insulin resistance, like junk food, makes things worse much faster. So it's not that we have to worry about becoming insulin resistant as we age. It's that we need to find out now how insulin resistant we are, and to have that tested makes no sense at all, because it doesn't tell you anything other than you're a certain degree of insulin resistant, and that having some numbers doesn't matter. What do you do with that information? And so very early on, my dietary recommendations were to start reducing. First, the standard recommendation was to eliminate junk food, then reduce things that in the very beginning, I would have them reduce sugar, slowly reduce the sugar until there's no sugar intake. And because people had a hard time going cold turkey. And, I finally realized that didn't make sense. We needed to go cold turkey. If you're destroying your body, let's stop doing that right away. And then we would gradually kind of juggle the macronutrients, let's increase protein, or let's increase fat, and I realized that was just too tedious. Let's go cold turkey, the most important macronutrient to do this with is carbohydrate, because it has an immediate impact on our metabolism. So my idea was to let's bring the carbohydrates way down to a low level, make up the macronutrient calories with protein and fat, and let's see how you feel. And let's say, okay, this person has fatigue. They're waking up in the middle of the night. They, they're depressed. They get shaky before meals. They get tired after meals, whatever. Let's take all of the symptoms. And if they have some signs like high blood pressure, let's consider all of that. And let's lower the carbohydrate, increase the protein and fat, and let's see what happens with your signs and symptoms. Well, it was amazing. In a short period of time, I thought 10 days would be enough, but sometimes it was a little tricky, and it took a little longer, and I eventually ended up with 2 weeks. And this is a food challenge. And so I called it the 2-week test, where we want to test this person's metabolic state. How do you feel when your carbohydrates are here? And if you feel much better, and some of these people would say, well, I feel like a new person. All these symptoms went away. My blood pressure's down. This was a learning tool that was very valuable. I wanted people to rationalize how to eat better, but I wanted them to feel it. And there's no better way to help somebody than let them feel what it's like to feel good. And then we can go from there. And then after the 2-week test, we might put back some of the natural carbohydrates. And sometimes that was too much for people. And so now they know their level of tolerance. They know they can't exceed a certain amount of natural carbohydrate intake. And as the years would go on, they would have to diminish the fruit intake or diminish other natural carbohydrates that at one time they could tolerate, but they can't now because they're 50 or 60 years old. And that's sort of how animals do it. It's a very intuitive, instinctual thing. And we can do the same thing with symptoms.
I love that. And I wanted to make sure that we touch on overfat. So you've said it a few times, to distinguish this from being overweight. Let's sort of define the term overfat, and then what are some of the metabolic consequences of someone who is overfat? And I wanted to, pair this with some of your observations. I was talking to you in the pre-chat, and I was like, I want to talk a little bit about how this affects outcomes in COVID and with the pandemic. So let's talk a little bit about what overfat is. What are some of the consequences, metabolic and otherwise? I think there's it sort of affects everything. But what are some of the consequences of having excess adiposity?
I started using the word overfat many, many years ago. I saw it in a journal, and I thought, well, this is a much more this is a better term. Except they had 2 words, overfat. And as you know, the word fat is a very touchy word for people. And so
it's also a macronutrient, which I think messes people up. It's like, if I eat this macronutrient, I'm going to,
yeah. And it's essential. There are essential fatty acids that we can't survive without. Humans in the beginning had a diet that was mostly fat, not a lot of protein, and of course, not much, if any, carbohydrate. So I started writing about overfat in my books, and eventually, I don't remember when, several years ago, wrote a paper on defining overfat, underfat, and defined what overfat was, and I defined it as excess body fat that impairs health and fitness, which means we need a certain amount of body fat. There's a range of normal for body fat that we all have to have. It's a very important metabolic organ for us. We use it for our immune system. We use it for thermal regulation. We use it for energy, of course.
Fertility.
So there's so many benefits of body fat, healthy body fat. And as I was putting all this together, I thought, let's see what information is out there. And there are percentage ranges that I don't want to get into because people are confused by that. But it's not that less is better. The right amount is what you want. And I'll tell you how people can determine whether they're over fat or not. But I estimated the world prevalence of over fat at 76%.
Globally.
Yeah. And I thought, wow, that's a hard sell. Maybe I should lower.
It's like everyone is the problem.
and I got some comments from other scientists, those numbers are kind of high. And several years later, as I'm seeing more studies come out that are referencing that paper, and now I had done, what percentage of overfat people are there in the US? I showed that 91% of adults were overfat in the US. I showed that 80% of adults in India were overfat. And other areas of the world. And then I realized, and finally one more paper came out that kind of confirmed my suspicions, which was it's much worse than we think. As bad as those numbers are, it's much worse than we think based on what other scientists are now coming up with. And so I wrote a paper called Revising the Overfat Pandemic or something like that. And I realized that we can define overfat as people who are overweight, people who are obese, plus 20 to 40% of normal weight people. That's a pretty terrible situation that we've gotten ourselves into because of the marketing of junk food. And that's really what's causing this. And it's a hard sell. Fat is a hard sell. People want to avoid it. People don't, they deny having too much. They say, well, I accept my excess body fat. This is me. Sorry, that doesn't work. That's not rational. It's a problem. It's a health problem. It's a metabolic problem. It's a physical, biochemical, and mental, emotional problem. And it's preventable and it's treatable successfully. So the big question is, how do you know if you're overfat? You can get a DEXA scan. I don't recommend it because if you're going to get one, you have to have another one to see if you're getting better. And there's no reason to have that exposure and pay that expense to come up with a number when there's a pretty much equally excellent assessment tool. And that's measuring the waist and the height. The waist to height ratio is a very good indicator of being overfat. You want your waist to be less than half your height. And if it's not, you're overfat. Period.
Right. Yeah.
And if you're looking to cheat on that, I suggest you do it in the morning because you're a little taller. Your spine's a little longer after a night's sleep.
The discs are a little fuller. Yep.
Yeah. So you can cheat a little bit, but don't play
But
games.
it's not going to change it that much. Like I
No.
ran my waist to height. I was 0.41. But like, I can't imagine how much tall, like it's going to be, I don't know, how much can I expect to be taller first thing in the morning? And it sort of is, as soon as you stand up, you're sort of, the discs are subject to gravity as
they are. But if you measure this, if you get, with an architectural ruler, measure the spine or just measure somebody's height, in the course of a day and then first thing in the morning, sometimes you'll see a half-inch difference. That's not common. And any kind of therapy, hands-on therapy that is successful results in people getting taller because their muscles get balanced and their spine lengthens and they get taller. And you could see that half-inch sometimes in the course of before and after treatment.
Or even their ability to activate certain muscles as well will be augmented after. Yeah, that's true. So what about underfat? Is there, if you're trying to get under 0.5 when we're looking at waist to height, is there a lower level to that as well?
There really isn't. I've tried to see if there was. There's really no research that I'm aware of that's credible to say this is, the range of normal waist to height ratio, low normal to high normal. I've not seen that. Mostly under fat is something you can determine either with a DEXA scan or some of the good body fat percentages, and you can see the ranges of normal in your situation. But under fat is something we see in a very unhealthy person, or as we talked about earlier, in an overtrained person. They overtrain on the one hand, and then on the other hand, they undereat. In particular, they undereat fat because eating fat makes you fat, so we think, which is untrue. And underfat is a very serious problem. We see it a lot in cancer patients, in cachexia, for example. Although sarcopenia is often associated with overfat. As we lose a lot of muscle, we impair metabolism and we start gaining body fat.
Right, and you have that fatty infiltration of the muscle as well. So how does this impact outcomes in something like a viral infection? So of course, the viral infection that has captured the world, the most famous one right now would be COVID-19 and its many Greek alphabet variants. How does being overfat, and I have certain thoughts around how it happens, but how does it impact our ability to fight off a respiratory illness?
Well, what being overfat does, we have to look at the trickle down effect of being overfat. What are the end results of that condition? One of them is that we increase the risk of chronic disease, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's. All these things are secondary to problems like chronic inflammation, which is secondary to excess body fat. That's number one. Another is that we are more vulnerable to physical impairments, not just athletic injuries, but more serious physical impairments, arthritis and that kind of thing. But what also happens with overfat, because the immune system is so well involved with normal body fat, when that normal body fat is now abnormal, our immune system is impaired. And so now we're vulnerable to infections. It's really that simple.
Right. And I was listening to Dr. Robert McCullough, who's just been at the forefront of this whole, pandemic and some of the things that are maybe going awry with these metabolic distortions. And in the adipose tissue, of course, we used to think that it was just sort of this like benign, jiggly white stuff, right? Sometimes brown. But we have this secretion of interleukin-6, right? So you are always, if you have excess adiposity, you always have this sort of low level, chronic low-grade inflammation vis-a-vis this increase in interleukin-6, which is a pro-inflammatory cytokine. So now you have this spike protein, you have this respiratory illness that now is able to induce these, the infamous now cytokine storms. And part of that, I think, is mediated with the adipose tissue secreting, copious amount. If the virus infiltrates, the adipose tissue, you will have copious amounts of release of this particular interleukin-6, which then can, propagate this big cytokine storm, which, is basically your immune system, going AWOL.
Yeah, I have a paper called The Perfect Storm, referring to that, because what we have actually is the chronic inflammatory state, which is typical of overfat, and then we have the acute inflammation, which is associated with infections, and that's a very important feature. And I'm writing a new paper, which should be published soon, on COVID and this whole idea. And basically, I'm saying that COVID is not a pandemic. COVID is a problem that is best referred to as a syndemic. A syndemic is a holistic way of looking at things. A syndemic is, you look at this COVID pandemic over here, it's one isolated condition, which it's not. And you say, oh, wait a minute. There's this other pandemic called the overfat pandemic, which has set up the entire population to develop COVID. And it's an interesting thing that, again, we tend to dumb down things in the society. We want to, it's the medical model, really. There's a bug that attacks you, and we've got a drug to attack the bug. Well, we know that doesn't work. We've seen what bacteria do to antibiotics, for example. And in this case, we're trying out vaccines thinking, well, that's going to save the day. Well, it hasn't. We didn't develop herd immunity from COVID exposure the first year. And now that we've had vaccines for a while, we haven't developed herd immunity as a result of vaccines. In fact, a lot of people who've been vaccinated properly haven't responded and have gotten sick. And the reason they don't respond is because even vaccines need a relatively healthy immune system to work right. And giving vaccines to just everybody as a blanket therapy is just really silly. First of all, we don't have enough vaccines for everybody. Second, a lot of people who have all these downstream effects of being overfat impairs their ability to respond to a vaccine.
Right. And I've always wondered why, and it's, maybe there's some, political malingering here, but I think that why has that only ever been presented as the only option? Like, I have yet to hear one elected official talking about going outside, getting some sunshine, and going for just doing some low-level activity in the way that we've been talking about. And I think that part of it is because that's a really hard, as you were saying, it's a really hard sell. When you have 91% of the population, and you're like, listen, 91% of y'all have to, y'all have to do something. You have to get up and walk. I think that that's really, first, that elected official won't get back elected again, because it's difficult to tell the entire electorate that, the way that you have, this is like WALL-E, that movie WALL-E, where they have to leave Earth and they're sitting in these, they're all this obese population is, just driving themselves everywhere. That's literally what I think we have. And nobody's willing to say, listen, you guys have to build some muscle. It's like you have this overfat, under-muscled, population. that's sedentary, that doesn't have like I haven't heard anybody talk about that. It's only been you need the vaccine no matter what. The kids need the vaccines no matter what. And if you don't get it, then you're even if you've had natural exposure to the virus, where now you have your own naturally, like you have natural immunity, which now, I mean, it's a whole other conversation where that's not even considered to be on par with vaccination. It's like even
Yeah,
if you've been exposed to it, it's like you have to get vaccinated. And I don't
yeah, it's
understand
sad
that.
because they're not even basing things on physiology. They're basing it on political. Everything's political, and including saying, okay, we're gonna bypass the regulations that we set up to protect the public. So you drug companies, you can just make these vaccines and we'll buy them. We're gonna put billions of dollars into your bank account, and don't worry about, we'll see what happens to the public, and if something bad happens, then we'll figure out what to do. And it's a problem, and it takes the responsibility away from us. And there's so many other factors. And in my current paper, I'm talking about the importance of sulfur-rich foods like cruciferous vegetables, and yeah, sulforaphane, and that makes glutathione, which is our most important antioxidant. But those sulfur in particular is something that we use on our cells to protect our bodies from incoming invasions of viruses and bacteria. And they're showing that the lack of sulfur, the poor sulfur metabolism, is allowing this to happen. And that's a big part of the process as well. So again, it's the junk food diet that causes the overfat. And the junk food diet doesn't just cause people to be overfat. The junk food diet displaces healthy foods. So now we're really in a state of malnutrition. And so the junk food diet makes us overfat. Even if we go out and sit in the sun every day, we're not going to get the vitamin D we need, because people who are overfat tend to not metabolize vitamin D. So they can sit in the sun all they want. They're not going to, even if they take vitamin D, they may not restore their levels to normal because they're overfat.
So what do we do? What's the you can sort of get into these rabbit holes and be like, God, like there's no politician that's ever going to speak up for metabolic health and efficiency or aerobic capacity. So we have to, maybe stop delegating stop making them the parent, and do put on our big girl pants and big boy pants. And, where do we start? If I have some, one of my audience members now is listening to me like, listen, I know that I've been eating all the bread. I've been much more sedentary than I should be. What are some of the things that individual might start to do that doesn't feel overwhelming? Because I think that the overwhelm, and we were talking a lot about this in terms of societal pressures, and like, you got to do the big thing, like the big diet, the big exercise, what are some of the things that are going to move the needle for this person? So
you've got to do the latest diet, not just the big thing. It's the latest diet, whatever the media is pushing. And you use the right word, overwhelm. People are overwhelmed. First of all, they don't trust the government. And so when the government says, eat this way and exercise that way, they just don't trust that. A lot of that is wrong because, as I showed in one of my studies, as exercise levels have been rising in recent years, overfat has been rising even more. So another, and I just did a study with a team of researchers, and we showed that how dramatically significant that the diet had on body fat loss than exercise. Basically, the diet wins out hands down. And
So
so,
even for shows, like I've competed in figure competitions, like 80% diet, like you could, kind of get to the gym. I mean, I still trained, but 80% of how you look really is the food that you put in your body.
yeah, yeah. But I think to avoid, and there's some good studies about how many recommendations people can tolerate. It's not very many. And so in some of my papers, when I talk about, well, okay, here are the problems well outlined. Now, what do we do? And I'm careful not to, babble on about all the standard recommendations, because first of all, they're wrong. But people, as soon as they start hearing all these things, they shut down. And then they say, well, I'm not going to do anything. I've tried all those things. It doesn't work. Just one thing. If you want to improve your health and protection from COVID and other infections and be healthier, stop eating junk food. That's it. Stop eating junk food. And your body fat will come down. And it's not that you have to wait for it to come down, but as soon as your metabolism changes, which occurs after 2 meals, actually. So as soon as you change your bad metabolism and make it better, your immune system will start working better. Your gut, your brain, everything will slowly start working better. And that could be a big factor very quickly. And so we have to take responsibility. We're in charge of our bodies, not the government, not healthcare, that's for sure. And so we need to take charge. That's really the best recommendation, and the one that's going to help the fastest is getting rid of junk food.
Yeah, and I'm going to butcher this quote, but the fastest way to get there is slowly, right? So it's like just do and maybe you want to just change the way you eat for 4 months, and that's the only intervention that you do. And like to your point around people wanting to throw everything at it, like just make the one thing, and then at 4 months you can say, hey, you know what? Maybe I'll go for a lunchtime walk, or I'll set a little alarm on my phone and I'll do like 10 squats or something, every hour on the hour, something like that. And you do that for another 4 months. And then you add something else on, you prioritize sleep, you just layer on all these health habits.
Yeah, I think when people, and I've just seen this for years and years, when people start changing their metabolism and reducing body fat, things start falling into place. They start feeling better. They start looking better. They start acting better. They can think better. And once that starts to happen, the rest falls into place quickly. They become more intuitive. They want to walk more. They want to be active. But you've got to get that start with something that's going to change quickly. It shouldn't take months before you step on the scale and see a change, which doesn't mean anything because you could lose weight and still be over fat.
Right. Or your body comp could be changing. Like you could be gaining muscle and losing fat, and the weights, like the scale is a very poor indicator of what's going on.
It is. I've seen way too many people gain weight and lose 2 inches on their waist.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, where can people find more about your work? We're going to make sure that we reference all of the papers and articles at your website, but where can people find out more about you and your work and the literature that you're producing?
The health and fitness website is philmaffetone.com. And if you go to the medical library, you just type my name in, you'll see all my papers. But I think all the papers I've published in recent years, we posted a press release on my website, which kind of describes the paper in simple terms. So they're all there as well. And, with all the articles like the one on what really is junk food, that's a really important one. The 2-week test There's a whole article that will guide you through the test, do this, do that. And so that website has all my health and fitness material.
Amazing. Well, we'll make sure that those are in the show notes. This has been such a pleasure chatting with you. I know that my audience is going to get such amazing value out of all the wisdom that you've shared today. And hopefully we can make slow sexy. We can go slow, and that can be, we can surrender to the slowness, because that's, as I was saying, the fastest way to get there is slowly. So thank you so much.